Thank you very much to the Dean for the introduction. Thank you very much to the Hellenic Open University and for my part, especially to the Fulbright Commission for funding my participation and attendance here at the conference today. No, that's fine. So what I wanted to do, the title of my presentation is Labour's Spatial Praxis and the Uneven Development of Capitalism, Why We Must Examine More Than Just Capital to Understand the Geography of the Crisis. And so when Stelios and I were talking about my participation here, we thought that perhaps giving at the beginning, a broad overview of thinking about the links between workers and space and workers and geography would be a good way of doing so. So what I want to talk about today is a paper in 4 parts. So the first part, what I want to do is to outline some of the early work that was done that tried to connect questions of political power on the one hand and space and spatiality on the other. Secondly then, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about some of the early critical work in geography starting in the 1970s, at least in Anglo-American geography starting in the early 1970s, that really tried to look at the way in which capitalism as a system functions, and in particular to look at the way in which the production of landscapes, the production of space is really central to the way in which capitalism functions as a economic system. And in other words, to try to understand the phenomenon of uneven development. How does uneven development come about? The third part of my talk then, what I'll do is to talk a little bit about the emergence of the field of labour geography and trying to think about the role played by workers in shaping patterns of uneven development and producing landscapes under capitalism. And then finally, I'll present very briefly a couple of case studies actually that Stelios and I have worked on together that relate to Greek workers in the current situation, and it seems a little bit strange for me to be here talking about, as a visitor from the United States, talking to Greeks about the Greek situation. So I'm sure you probably know far more about it than I do, but nevertheless, I will do my best. So to start off with the first part, since, as I mentioned, since the early 1970s, in the Anglophonic world, geographers, at least critical geographers, have been particularly interested in questions of space and power. What's interesting about the emergence of this theme of research, though, is that a lot of the early work actually drew upon the work of 2 theorists who were not geographers. They both happened to be French. And these were Michel Foucault and Henri Lefebvre. So to talk for a few moments about Foucault, Foucault, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was particularly interested in the role of the state in regulating bodies, and he published a particularly influential book that came out in French in 1975, Surveiller et punir, Naissance de la prison. The English translation is Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison. And Lefebvre was particularly interested in the way in which the internal designs of prisons were set up in such a way that the physical architecture of the prison could be used as a way to control socially the behavior of prisoners. He was also interested in other institutions of modern state, so he was interested in the public school, the set out of the classroom, for example. He was interested in how hospitals were designed architecturally as a way to control the behavior of the patients. And so basically this was what many geographers took from Foucault, was the notion of the connection between the spatial organization of institutions and society on the one hand and the exercise of political power on the other. So one of the famous quotes from Foucault in this regard is that he suggested that discipline, in the sense of the ability of the state to regulate the activities of individual citizens, that discipline proceeds from the distribution of individuals in space. The second person that many of the early geographers drew on was Henri Lefebvre. And Lefebvre was also interested in issues of space and power, but at a broader scale. So he was more really interested in the connections between how capitalism as an economic and a political system functions and the geography that is produced under capitalist forms of organization. And so this is most closely expressed in a couple of publications of his, both from the early 1970s. The English titles of the two books are The Survival of Capitalism, The Reproduction of the Relations of Production, which came out in 1973, and then a book which came out in 1974 called The Production of Space. And as I mentioned, Lefebvre was very interested in this connection then between how capitalism as a social system and an economic system functions, and how it functions as a geographical system. So just to pull a few quotes that I think exemplify what he was trying to talk about. He talked, for example, about how every society produces a space, its own space, that space is a social product, it serves as a tool of thought and of action. It is also a means of control and hence of domination and of power. And so what he argued, particularly in these two books that I've just referenced, is the notion that capitalism has a particular geography to it. There is a reason that we see patterns of uneven development that are not just incidental to the way in which capitalism as a system operates, but they're actually central to the way in which capitalism as an economic system operates. And so the geography of the system plays an important role in shaping how it functions. So possibly the most quoted quote from his book, The Production of Space, you see this quote everywhere, is the following. He argued that capitalism has found itself able to attenuate, if not resolve, its internal contradictions for a century, and consequently, in the 100 years since the writing of Capital, obviously by Karl Marx, it has succeeded in achieving growth. We cannot calculate at what price, but we do know the means, by occupying space, by producing a space. So in other words, the production of landscapes is central to the way in which the system functions. So essentially what he was arguing then is that there's a dialectical connection between the mode of production, whether this is capitalism, feudalism, some other form of social and political organization, and the landscapes that develop, the economic landscapes that develop under these systems. And so that consequently, Lefebvre was a Marxist. He was interested in social transformation, and he was suggesting that if we were to see some kind of post-capitalist society, then what he suggested is that this would bring along its own new geography. As he said, there's a new social relationship called for a new space, and vice versa. So that for Lefebvre, any social revolution, quote, that does not produce a new space has not realized its full potential. Indeed, it has failed. That has not changed life itself, but has merely changed ideological superstructures, institutions, or political apparatuses. And that for a truly revolutionary transformation to take place, this must manifest a creative capacity in its effects on daily life, on language, and importantly for what we're talking about here, on space. So that's kind of the background to what geographers in the Anglophonic world were starting to play with, the ideas they were starting to play with in the early 1970s with regards to thinking about the connections between the way in which capitalism functions and the production of landscape. This itself was quite a radical change from the way in which at least economic geography had been done in the United States and in Britain up until then. Up until then, economic geography had largely been a fairly conservative discipline. It had largely drawn on the principles of neoclassical economics. It was largely interested in looking at differences between places across the economic landscape. And the economic landscape was largely seen merely as a stage upon which the important social action played out. It wasn't really seen to have any kind of constituted role in the whole process. And so, to quote Foucault, in this perspective, space was treated as the dead, the fixed, the undialectical, the immobile. Time, on the contrary, was richness, fecundity, life, dialectic. So, in the early 1970s, a number of geographers then really began to challenge this way of thinking about how economic geographies are made under capitalism. I'm sure you're familiar with many of these people. So we had in the UK, Doreen Massey, for example. She wrote a very influential book called Spatial Divisions of Labour, in which she talked about how different over the generations, different layers of capital investment go into particular landscapes to shape the way in which they develop. She argued in her book that, quote, the geography of the society makes a difference to the way it works. It is not just that the spatial is socially constructed, the social is spatially constructed too. We have in the United States at UCLA, Ed Soja, writing a little bit later on, who talked about what he called the socio-spatial dialectic. So to think about, for example, the way in which social relations shape spatial structures, but also the way in which the economic landscape is physically made shapes the way in which social relations subsequently develop. We have David Harvey, who is English originally, but was writing in the United States. In the early 1980s, in his book, The Limits to Capital, he developed the concept of what he called the spatial fix, where he argued that capital and capitalists, different factions of capital, need to create particular spatial configurations if the process of accumulation is to occur. We have his student, Harvey's student, Neil Smith, in his book, Uneven Development, follows the arguments of Harvey. Smith argued, for instance, that he says that space is not a dead factor. In other words, it's not just another variable that you add to some kind of regression analysis. Space is not a dead factor. Instead, it comes alive neither as a separate thing, field or container, but as an integral creation of the material relations of society. So he suggested, based upon that, then the fundamental question, as he put it, was not just what capitalism does to geography, but rather what geography can do for capitalism and how the geographical configuration of the landscape contributes to the survival of capitalism through the production on uneven development. This was all good stuff. I think it helped to really make some connections between capitalism as a social, economic, political system on the one hand and as a geographical system on the other. But the problem, I think, was that it largely ignored the active role of workers in this production of uneven development. And so we can see a couple of quotes that I've pulled sort of pseudo-randomly to make my point. From Harvey, in one of his articles in the late 70s, he said that it is capital that, quote, represents itself in the form of a physical landscape created in its own image, that's the key word there, the key phrase there, and builds a physical landscape appropriate to its own condition at a particular moment in time. Smith, likewise, focused very much upon the activities of capital to try to understand the production of uneven development. So he argued that the geography of uneven development, quote, derives specifically from the opposed tendencies inherent in capital, that's the key phrase, inherent in capital towards the differentiation but simultaneous equalization of the levels and conditions of production. What capital, quote, achieves in fact is the production of space in its own image. So, as I said, these works by people like Harvey and Smith were very important for making the connections theoretically between thinking about how capitalism functions as an economic system and the kinds of geographies, economic geographies, that are made under how uneven development developed. But they tended to really ignore the role of workers as active geographical agents in producing uneven development. So the third part of my talk today then is to just talk a little bit about the emergence of this field that has come to be known as labor geography. And so what this field really does is to try to make the argument that not only does capital and different segments of capital try to make the economic landscape in certain ways so that it can function, but the workers also have a vested interest in shaping the way in which the economic landscape functions to produce a landscape of employment rather than unemployment, for example. And so if we can borrow a phrase from Marx, which is possibly my favorite phrase from him, but somewhat amended with a geographical imagination here. Those of you, many of you I'm sure will recognize this as coming from the 18th Brumaire. Marx talks about history, but here we're going to talk about geography. So if we can adopt Marx's famous phrase, to suggest that what labour geographers argue is that workers make their own geographies, but they do not make them just as they please. They do not make them under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. The landscapes made by all the dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living. I love that quote. I have no idea what it is in German. It's probably a lot longer in German, but in English it has a certain resonance. So what does this mean for thinking about the production of economic landscapes and the production of uneven development? I think there are at least 5 different things that we can point to and that labour geographers have pointed to with regards to thinking about the production of economic landscapes and the production of uneven development. The first is that there is clearly a particular geography to capitalism. The landscapes produced under capitalism and different types of capitalism look different, for example, from the landscapes produced under feudalism or Soviet-style central planning, so that there is a clear and particular geography to capitalism that workers must engage with. They must negotiate these landscapes in particular ways. The second argument is that through their activities then, that workers have the potential to shape how the geography of capitalism and how the geography of uneven development is made. And so in this regard, they must be seen not simply as sort of cultural dupes, but really as active geographical agents. The third is to think about how the imagined economic geography of capitalism that workers might want to see emerge is very different from the kind of landscapes that capitalists may want to see emerge. Capitalists are interested in producing landscapes of profitability. Workers might be interested in making sure that there are landscapes of employment that are produced. Well, having a landscape of profitability and a landscape of employment are not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes they are, but often they're not. The fourth aspect is that different groups of workers are likely to have different visions for how they would like to see the economic landscapes under capitalism made. In other words, the workers are not some monolithic block. Not all workers have the same sets of interests. They have different sets of interests depending upon their history, their culture, their physical location in the landscape, and a whole slew of other factors. And then finally, that workers often seek to make new geographical scales of their own social and political organizations. So we can think about as they seek perhaps to move from the local to national systems of bargaining, or perhaps as they seek to develop transnational organizations. So all of that leads up to the last part of the talk in the last few minutes, which is to talk about 2 examples or 2 sets of case studies in which workers have played a role in certainly challenging the kinds of employment structures and the kinds of landscapes that are emerging here in Greece. And this work is very much work that both Stelios and I have worked on together. So I only have a few minutes to talk about this, but if anybody's interested in longer or more detailed stories, you can go to these 2 references. One of the articles is published in Geoforum, and the other is published in Human Geography. So the first study, the first case study of workers shaping how the new economic landscapes of capitalism are unfolding in Greece during the crisis, is to talk a little bit about some immigrant strawberry pickers. I'm sure, as I said, many of you will be more familiar about this story than I am, given that you live here and I do not. But basically, as many will know, I'm sure, in Neomanalada, I hope I'm not butchering the Greek pronunciation of that town, is a center of the Greek strawberry industry. A lot of the workers there are immigrant workers. They're from Pakistan, they're from Bangladesh, they're Roma from places like Bulgaria. This is a very casualized workforce. And in 2008, several hundred workers of these strawberry pickers gathered in the town's central square to protest against their poor working conditions, to protest against their low wages, and to protest the fact that many of them had not received the wages that they were entitled to for several months. And they were attacked by bodyguards that had been hired by some of the local landowners. Interestingly enough, although many of the local people didn't say much in response, because many of them were related to the farmers, This activity in Neo Manolada did bring about a much broader response. Workers in other parts of Greece and then also in other parts of the world sent letters of support for the strawberry workers, and this represents an effort or a success rather of the strawberry workers to actually transform the geographical scale of their dispute, a very local dispute, to in many ways making it an international dispute. So you can see, for example, here on this banner here, it says from Manolada to Islamabad and Cairo, emphasizing the new geographical scales that people were organizing at. There were also demonstrations held here in Athens. There was food sent from some other communities to support the farm workers. And in the end, fearing that they would lose their crop, the strawberry farmers agreed finally to negotiate with the workers and to raise their wages. So this is an example of a highly vulnerable, highly precarious labor force actually managing to secure higher wages in the context of a very tricky situation by making geographical connections with workers in other places. The second example, again, which I'm sure you are more familiar with than I am, but I'm going to start talking about it, is the case of the Power Workers Union, GENOP, I guess is the acronym in Greece, that was very active in supporting popular protests against the new property tax that the government had implemented in response to the crisis. As I'm sure you know, in September 2011, the government announced it would collect a special tax to be able to repay some of the international loans by attaching a special tax to the power bills that were sent to the customers of the Public Power Corporation. The Power Workers Union did not like this. It responded by refusing to cut off the electricity of those who would not pay the tax. But interestingly enough, they did cut off the power to the health ministry because the health ministry had not paid their tax. But what's interesting about this campaign is that the union managed to develop both what we might call in-place and transspatial strategies with regards to this particular dispute. In other words, focusing both on local actions here in Athens, but again, in nationalizing the dispute by making connections with communities right across Greece. So in response to this pressure, the government was forced to relent somewhat, and by the end of 2012, about 500,000 people had not paid their tax, and this has forced the power company to change its tactics. So just to summarize, in the last 2 minutes, if I may, what I've tried to suggest then is a number of things that I think are maybe helpful for thinking about the geography of the crisis and the uneven development that it's producing. The first of these is that social actors are clearly geographically embedded in particular places, and that this shapes the possibilities for their social action. The second is that different sets of social actors are tied into a local, regional, national, and transnational relationship in quite different ways. And this geographical specificity shapes the possibility for their activities. Going back to Marx, they have some freedom of choice, but they are not completely free to choose the actions in which they will engage. Different sets of social actors will often have very different visions for how they would like to see the economic landscape made. How they behave in turn will shape how these economic landscapes are made, so that we can think about economic landscapes really as contested social products. There is a politics, a very vibrant politics that goes into making these landscapes in some ways and not others. That landscapes then are not merely reflective of social relations, but they also are constitutive of them. There's a socio-spatial dialectic. This requires us to reevaluate the traditional Marxist approach rather than thinking simply about a historical materialism. We perhaps need to think about a historical geographical materialism. And finally, we need to think about the issue of worker agency and how it's contextual. The workers may have some agency, but they don't have infinite agency. And we need to think about some of the contexts that shape a role in shaping how much agency they may have in particular places. So this may reflect the different types of capital that they're having to confront. This may reflect the types of local or translocal solidarity and networking that they're able to engage in. And also the timing of struggles. Is the economy booming or is the economy in recession, for instance? So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your attention. Again, thank you to the Hellenic Open University and to the Fulbright Commission here in Greece for